Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful Heron and Waterlily painting inspired by a fantastic painting done by my daughter for her YouTube art channel, Morgana Rose Art. It's a wonderful tutorial for a superb wet in wet watercolour painting of this heron and this beautiful calm lake with the most delicate sunset sky. It's done just using two colours, so it's very much in the vein of the sort of paintings that I like to do myself, using a limited palette and just letting the subjects speak for themselves. So please follow the link below to see her tutorial for this beautiful heron painting that has inspired mine. And as she's just starting out on her YouTube journey, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to her and give her a like and tell her I sent you over to say hello. So let's see what I can do inspired by that beautiful sunset painting. I'm going to go for a full summer painting and a heron wading amongst some water lilies with the beautiful sun sort of reflecting through the trees and turning that water sort of green and yellow. So I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press paper. It's taped to my board. My board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, and using a large Pro Art Harkey brush, I'm wetting the paper all over, having first drawn out a very simple outline of a heron and a few lily pads, lily flowers, and then using masking fluid to mask out the flowers and just a couple of little white areas on the heron to protect the white of the paper while I do this all over wet in wet graduated wash. It's almost a flat wash, but it's graduated because there are slightly different hues within the wash to give it some interest and some light. So I'm just sweeping my brush in horizontal sweeps with mixtures of gamboge hue and ultramarine blue, Cotman tube paints, sweeping it across the page, allowing the paint to drift down the page, and then as soon as the wash looks sort of beautiful and even but still quite intense, I'm going to lay my board flat here like this and then mix in a bit more ultramarine blue and darken up across the bottom a bit. And then to add that sort of sunlit look to the painting, firstly I shall use some paper tissue to dab out the body of the heron so that my greys will be quite clean when I paint them in. And secondly, I'm going to flick some water onto the page with my hand, and the little water droplets will cause tiny little bursts and blooms and give that kind of dappled sunlight kind of look without having to paint it in. It's a very pretty effect. I shall now leave it to dry completely. So it's now completely dry, but please note it's a lot brighter than this in real life. The sun's streaming through the windows, which is wonderful, but it's bleaching out the colour a bit. So I will show the brighter finished painting, which you saw at the beginning of the video. I shall show it at the end of the video too. To paint the heron, I'm going to start off using my small calligraphy brush. I'm going to paint the heron with water first. The reason for doing this is that I want a nice soft underpainting for the heron's feathers and then just a little bit of detailed darker accents. But to start with, I want a nice even coating. So by wetting the heron's body first carefully, when I just drop in some wet paint, it will diffuse into the water that's on the page and sort of run down the page because the board's at 45 degrees. And so I will get some sort of very subtle gradations of grey colour throughout the heron, just with the water running wet in wet within the confines of the wet paper of its body, if you see what I mean. And I shall add slightly more Payne's Grey, which is the third colour that I'm using in this painting, to make some slightly darker areas across the wings and the belly, and a little bit of shading, and just to start off that kind of the look of feathers and different coloured feathers from grey to black to white on this beautiful blue heron's body. So this is the underpainting. Once this is dry and I remove the masking fluid from the white areas, then I can finish the painting off with some really nice darks. But for now, I'm just going to get in my very rough sort of mid-tones and darks, and then let it dry. Some slightly darker Payne's grey across just the top of his little head and around the wing, and as you can see, it's softly diffusing into the wet paper and already creating some beautiful effects. And now I've mixed up a nice dark green using the gamboge and ultramarine blue, more on the blue side, to paint in the lily pads. I'm just going to put these in very loosely. I'm not going to define them. I'm going to keep the shapes keep some smooth edges on the outline so that sort of suggests the lily pads, if you see what I mean, and join them across the paper. And by having the board at 45 degrees, the wet paint is sort of running down and pooling across the bottom of the lily pads, which is giving me some slightly darker areas of shadow there, which is really nice, and it's a nice effect just to exploit what watercolour does when you let it flow when you have your board at an angle. I will add some more darks just to strengthen up that effect as well, which will mean I'll put some almost pure ultramarine blue into those areas, just to deepen up the green colour a little bit. And then across the top, in some places, I'll add a bit of pure gamboge just to suggest sunlight hitting the top parts of the lily pads. The brush I'm using for this is a synthetic Polina Bright size 1. It's a round quill brush with a really nice point, and I find it a lovely brush to use for leaves of all sorts and flowers. It was a gift, so I'm afraid I don't have a link for it. But any round brush or sort of medium calligraphy brush, or even a squirrel mop, would probably do the same sort of job. Leaving it to dry completely, I'm now going to put in some dark shadows below the lily pads using my 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush, and just sweeping in some Payne's grey, quite rich, underneath the lily pads here and there, making sure I don't cover the lily pads, but just putting in those dark shadows that will really help the shapes to show through negatively painting the water around the lily pads, but also keeping that side-to-side motion with the tips of the flat brush will give me the look of sort of ripples and reflections too, hopefully. And then once I've got enough shadows across the back, I'm going to keep working with my greens, my yellows and my greys to build up some effects of water just suggested in the background across behind the heron. I'm keeping this quite pale, much paler than the front, because I don't want this to distract. I want this just to provide that sort of backdrop for the heron, give it a little bit more context. But I'm keeping this background kind of very soft and very gentle. And with those little blooms of water, it almost gives a sort of bokeh effect, which I quite like, especially seeing the colours in real life that are much more vivid than they show at the moment. And again, just let that all dry, and then We can come back once it's dry, and with a clean finger or an eraser or the back of the gluey part of a bit of masking tape, you can remove the masking fluid, just carefully rubbing it off of all the little areas that are preserving the white. And now for the final bits of detail. Using my small calligraphy brush, I'm putting in the darks and the details, the cap on the top of the heron's head, the beak, a little dot for the eye. I'll put some yellow across the beak as well at some point, just to emphasise that. And then putting some nice darks just to help to define parts of the heron a little bit more strongly and to bring the loose background detail of his feathers together a bit more. I don't want this to be too detailed, so I'm using sort of minimal amounts of brush strokes here, but just enough hopefully to suggest some feather textures and some shadows around his tail and some sort of form and shape. That's just a little bit of gamboge on his beak. That makes it stand out really nicely. So I'm softening with the brush as I go so that I don't have too many hard outlines. I don't mind having a few spots that are much darker than others in a sort of outline for part of it, but I only want to have the outline where it's darkest, if you see what I mean. This is just Payne's Grey again, and I shall go over the heron's legs so that he's standing beautifully in the lily pond, fishing. And just soften back any of the masking fluid areas that are just where the edges are looking just a little bit harsh and a bit unnatural. So trying to integrate them into the heron as a whole. And then it's the water lilies. So I'm painting just these little upstanding water lily buds first, and then I shall use my fourth colour, which is alizarin crimson, to really make those water lilies pop. I'm not painting them in completely with pink, just parts of them, leaving some of the white showing through, so we get this lovely pink water lily flowers. And I'm going to put a little bit of the pink onto the buds of the water lily so you can just see a few of the petals showing through. So these are the final touches, and it's often a good way to make a loose painting really pop by just putting in a few little dark details or bright accents on top of the very loose underpainting. It can turn what looks a little bit loose and maybe a little bit sort of underwhelming into something that looks an awful lot better and more focused, and just tiny amounts of detail. Don't overdo the detail because then it gets lost. A little bit of detail just really makes it pop. Just some darks underneath the lily pad, some final darks, and then we can remove the tape. It's just ordinary decorator's masking tape, and I pull it away from the painting and then have a look at the painting with its clean white border, make sure it looks okay. I'm very pleased with that. I'm not really a bird or animal painter, so I'm very pleased with the way that went. But I was so inspired by Morgana's painting that I just had to give it a go. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you found it helpful. And I really hope that you will go over to Morgana's YouTube channel, Morgana Rose Art, and subscribe to her channel. She's got some wonderful tutorials there if you're interested in landscape, animal and particularly bird painting. as well as some absolutely stunning flower paintings there too. So please pop over and have a look. Tell her I sent you. Thanks so much, and thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel, and I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.